For decades, the Brentwood home of Rob Reiner and Michelle Singer Reiner had been held up as a quiet symbol of stability in a city built on illusion. It was the kind of place people pointed to when they wanted to believe that Hollywood fame did not have to come at the cost of family. 4 children grew up under that roof, surrounded by routine affection and the reassuring idea that love steady and patient could hold everything together. Family gatherings were warm, familiar, almost ordinary. Nothing about the house suggested that it would one day become the center of a story no one was prepared to hear. Then on the night of December 14th, everything changed without warning. Inside that same home, a violent tragedy unfolded, ending the lives of Rob and Michelle in a way that felt both sudden and incomprehensible. When police began their investigation and their son Nick was taken into custody as a suspect, many assumed the public shock would eventually settle into grim acceptance. For a brief moment, silence took over, as if the world itself needed time to breathe. But that silence did not last. What followed was not closure, but a deeper rupture, one that exposed hidden fractures beneath the family's calm exterior. Because soon after, a voice emerged from within the family itself, one that refused to let the story end with headlines alone. Tracy Reiner, the adopted daughter Rob had loved as his own, stepped forward and began to speak. And with her words, the image of a perfect family started to crack, revealing unfinished promises, buried regret, and a truth far more complicated than anyone had imagined. To the public, Rob Reiner was known as a filmmaker whose work celebrated human connection. But inside his own home, that philosophy was not a theme, it was a daily practice. Despite a career that demanded relentless focus travel and pressure, Rob organized his life around one unshakable priority: his children. Tracy, Jake, Nick, and Romy did not grow up orbiting fame. They grew up around presence. Rob made a point of being there, of listening, of turning ordinary moments into anchors of stability. His love was not loud or theatrical. It was steady, consistent, and deeply intentional. Tracy, whom Rob adopted from his first marriage, never felt like an addition or an afterthought. He treated her with the same respect and tenderness he offered his biological children, reinforcing again and again that family was defined by commitment, not blood. He spoke to her openly, encouraged her independence, and reminded her that no matter how strong she became, she would never face life alone. With Jake, the eldest son, Rob shared a quieter bond rooted in routine and tradition. Their shared love of baseball, passed down from Carl Reiner, became a language of its own. They traveled together, stadium by stadium, not chasing spectacle, but connection. Those trips were not about the game itself, but about time, about learning how to be together without pressure. Romy, the youngest, received a different kind of attention: gentle, attentive, deeply protective. Rob listened to her worries, her dreams, her disappointments, making sure she always felt seen and heard. To outsiders, the Reiner household looked like proof that fame did not have to fracture family life, and in many ways it was. Love flowed freely. Support was constant, yet even in that warmth there existed a contrast that no one fully understood at the time. Because among the 4 children, one relationship followed a far more fragile path, one that would quietly redefine everything they thought they knew about love, patience, and control. With Nick, the rhythm of family life shifted in ways that were subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. Rob loved his son deeply, but that love was braided with fear in a way he did not experience with his other children. Where Tracy, Jake, and Romy moved forward with a sense of direction, Nick seemed to stumble in place, pulled backward by forces no one in the family fully knew how to confront. From early on, there was a distance that resisted easy explanation. They did not share the effortless harmony Rob found elsewhere. Conversations felt strained, interests rarely aligned, and moments meant to bring closeness often ended in quiet frustration. As Nick grew older, instability began to surface more clearly. Rebellion hardened into volatility, and experimentation crossed lines that frightened everyone involved. By the time Nick was 15, drugs had entered his life, first as escape, then as necessity. Heroin and cocaine took hold quickly, dragging him into a cycle of addiction that would stretch across years. Rob and Michelle watched their son move in and out of rehabilitation centers more than a dozen times, endure periods of homelessness, and survive episodes where death felt dangerously close. Each relapse carried its own kind of devastation, reopening wounds that never had time to heal. Rob spent long nights awake in the Brentwood house, staring at the clock, replaying his choices as a father, searching for the moment where things might have gone differently. Love did not disappear during those years. It intensified, but it became desperate, reactive, uncertain. Professionals advised tough love boundaries, consequences. Rob listened, believing discipline might succeed where tenderness had failed. He forced Nick into treatment, cut off financial support, and hoped structure would save him. Later, Rob would admit that this decision haunted him more than any other. He realized too late that they had trusted credentials more than they trusted their son's voice, believing warnings that Nick was manipulating them. That belief carved deeper distance between them. Arguments escalated. Silences grew longer. There were years when Nick chose the streets over home, while his parents lived suspended in constant dread, unsure whether he was alive on any given day. The gap between father and son widened not from indifference, but from a collision of fear and love that neither knew how to navigate. This was not neglect. It was a family trapped inside its own effort to do the right thing, and the cost of that effort was slowly becoming unbearable. By the time the family reached what felt like its breaking point, exhaustion had become a permanent undercurrent. Years of crisis management had reshaped everyone's expectations, narrowing hope into something cautious and conditional. Yet even in that fatigue, Rob refused to give up on the possibility of connection. The release of Being Charlie in 2015 briefly appeared as an unexpected opening. Rob directed the film while Nick co-wrote the screenplay, drawing heavily from his own experiences with addiction and recovery. For the first time in years, father and son were forced into the same creative space, confronting each other not as patient and problem, but as collaborators. The process was volatile. Arguments erupted. Old grievances surfaced. Voices were raised in ways they had avoided at home. But something different happened beneath the conflict. They listened. Rob later admitted that those confrontations, painful as they were, allowed him to see Nick not only as a son in trouble, but as a man trying to articulate pain he had never been able to name. Nick, in turn, acknowledged that working alongside his father altered their dynamic, softening resentments that had hardened over time. For a while, it seemed possible that the worst had passed. Nick experienced periods of sobriety and lived in the guest house on the property, close enough to feel supported, distant enough to maintain autonomy. Yet stability remained fragile. Mental health struggles lingered, and the risk of relapse never fully receded. Michelle confided to friends that the family had tried everything they knew how to do and were slowly wearing down under the weight of constant vigilance. Then came the night that would later feel impossibly charged in retrospect. On December 13th, 2025, at Conan O'Brien's Christmas party, Rob arrived with Nick. The setting was festive, the mood outwardly light, but tension followed them into the room. In front of guests, Rob confronted his son, his frustrations spilling over after years of restraint. Nick responded with fury, his words fractured by accumulated hurt. When Rob finally said, "I can't keep protecting you if you continue to live like this," and walked away, the silence that followed felt heavy, almost prophetic. Many who witnessed the exchange later described it as deeply unsettling. What should have been an ordinary family disagreement now reads as a final rupture, the collapse of patience, forgiveness, and hope into a single, irreversible moment. Christmas night ended not with reconciliation, but with distance, and that distance would soon prove catastrophic. The following day unfolded with a cruel normality that only deepened the shock of what was to come. December 14th, 2025, did not begin as a date marked for disaster. It arrived quietly without warning signs, dramatic enough to demand intervention. Yet inside the Brentwood home, the Unresolved tension from the night before still hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. What happened next would later be reconstructed through investigation reports, forensic findings, and fragmented recollections, but no retelling could fully capture the speed with which the family's world collapsed. According to preliminary accounts, Nick was in an unstable emotional state, overwhelmed by addiction, resentment, and a sense of abandonment that had been building for years. In a sudden loss of control, an ordinary kitchen knife, an object that had belonged to the rhythms of daily life, became the instrument of irreversible violence. Michelle was attacked first, the chaos erupting so fast there was no time to comprehend what was happening. When Rob rushed in, instinctively trying to protect his wife, he was met with the same violence. The confrontation was brief, explosive, and devastating. In a matter of moments, a home that had once symbolized safety was transformed into a crime scene defined by shock and despair. Romy, the youngest daughter, arrived later that afternoon, expecting nothing more than a routine visit. Instead, she was confronted with a sight no child should ever have to witness. Her parents lay motionless, the familiarity of the space shattered beyond recognition. Unable to process what she was seeing, she called the police, her voice breaking as reality forced its way in. Nick fled shortly afterward, but was apprehended within hours by authorities near the University of Southern California. As news spread, Hollywood reacted with disbelief. A family long admired for its closeness had been destroyed from within. While the investigation continued, early findings pointed toward a moment of uncontrolled rage fueled by years of untreated pain. The tragedy did not feel sudden in hindsight, but that knowledge offered no comfort. It only raised questions that could never be answered about timing, about intervention, and about how love, fear, and silence had converged to produce the most unimaginable outcome. In the days that followed, as the investigation advanced and shock hardened into mourning, the story took another turn, one that shifted attention away from speculation and back toward the inner life of the family. Tracy Reiner, the adopted daughter Rob had loved as his own, chose to speak. Her decision was not performative, nor did it feel calculated. It felt necessary. When Tracy broke her silence, her voice carried the weight of someone still trying to understand how a life she had trusted could unravel so completely. She spoke of the suddenness of the loss of having seen her father only days before, still laughing, still present, still unmistakably alive. There had been no warning that suggested an ending so violent, so final. In her words, the pain was not only about what had happened, but about how little time there had been to prepare for it. Tracy described Rob and Michelle as parents who placed family above everything else, even when careers and responsibilities pulled in competing directions. She emphasized that their love was real, constant, and deeply felt, particularly toward Nick. According to Tracy, her parents worried about Nick more than anyone else, precisely because they understood how vulnerable he was. That concern extended into decisions meant to protect him, including provisions made in their will that left Nick a larger share of their assets, not as favoritism, but as reassurance. It was their way of saying that he was still their son, still loved, still worthy of care, regardless of his struggles. The most painful revelation came later when Tracy entered Rob's study and discovered a notebook her father had kept hidden away. Inside were not scripts or professional notes, but fragments of confession. Rob wrote about Nick with a hand that seemed unsteady, admitting regret for moments when he had believed toughness would lead to healing. He questioned whether distance had been mistaken for discipline, whether listening should have replaced instruction. One passage stood out above all others: Rob's fear that Nick might believe he had been abandoned. He wrote that if Nick ever felt unloved, the fault was his. These were words Rob had never spoken aloud. Tracy described reading them as devastating, not because they revealed cruelty, but because they revealed fear. Fear of saying the wrong thing. Fear of making things worse. Fear that love once spoken imperfectly might fail entirely. In that notebook, Tracy recognized the quiet tragedy beneath the public one: 2 generations bound by devotion, yet separated by a language neither fully mastered. And as she closed the pages, she understood that what had been left unsaid now carried a weight that words could no longer relieve. As Tracy's words settled into the public consciousness, another voice emerged, quieter, more restrained, yet carrying its own gravity. Romy Reiner, the youngest daughter, released a brief statement on behalf of the family asking for privacy during what she described as an immeasurably painful time. The message was short, almost austere, but its restraint spoke volumes. Romy had been the one to walk into the Brentwood home that afternoon, expecting nothing more than an ordinary visit, only to encounter a scene that would permanently divide her life into before and after. According to those close to the family, she was unable to speak for several moments, her body frozen as her mind struggled to accept what her eyes were seeing. In the days that followed, the psychological toll became impossible to ignore. Experts noted that trauma of this magnitude often leaves lasting scars, nightmares, guilt, emotional detachment, symptoms that do not fade simply because time passes. For the Reiner children, grief was layered with disbelief, anger, and a haunting sense of unfinished conversation. What made the loss especially unbearable was not only the violence itself, but the realization that love had existed at every stage of the story. Rob and Michelle had tried relentlessly to save their family. Nick had struggled, not out of indifference, but out of pain he could not contain. And Tracy, holding her father's notebook, saw clearly what had been invisible for so long, that silence had never meant absence of love. It had meant fear, fear of saying the wrong thing, fear of pushing too hard, fear that words might fail where patience had not. In the end, the tragedy resisted simple explanations. It was not a story of villains and victims, but of people locked inside patterns they did not fully recognize until it was too late. As the headlines faded and the investigation continued, what remained was a shattered family and a question that lingered long after the cameras turned away. How many lives are shaped not by what is done, but by what is left unsaid? Tracy closed her father's notebook, knowing that his love had been constant, even when his voice had faltered. Romy faced a future forever altered by a moment no one could undo. And the world was left to confront a painful truth. Sometimes the deepest tragedies are born not from hatred, but from love that never learned how to speak in time.